Okay, folks, welcome back to the Sociology of the Web. And in the last video, we watched some of the history, a quick history, if you will, of the information age into the internet. And we really focused on Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. And Web 1.0 is characterized by content consumption. Web 2.0 is characterized by content creation and sort of a democratization, a freeing of information, if you will, okay? And so this video lecture is going to build on that, and we're going to focus on a few things here: internet use over time, okay? And also social media, social networking use by various sociological variables: age, race, gender, education, okay? And then we're also going to look at mobile use over time. And I think this is going to, help to solidify that understanding that so much has happened in the last 25 years regarding information technology, and then the move into Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. And this is going to set us up for us to start looking in more detail about social interaction in the 21st century as it relates to the use of mobile technology and social media and social networking and virtual communities and that sort of thing. And we want to continue to think about how human interaction, human activity, engaging with technology, information technology, how this engagement further affects the development of the self, and even start to consider this idea of the real versus the virtual, the self that is in the real world and the self that maybe that we develop in terms of impression management online in the context of others and with the general public. And then, how do those overlap? How do they intermingle? And we'll also have some commentary on how changes since the coronavirus has really moved the self online and interacting with people in the workplace and in church and education and other social life is largely done now through online interaction. So having said that, we're going to first start by looking at, well, actually the brunt of this lecture, video lecture, will be based upon some data from the Pew Research Center. Now, the Pew Research Center does research on a lot of different social issues and social behaviors in society and culture, and a very reputable institution. And they are one of the go-to organizations that does track internet use, technology use, and the kinds of things that we've been talking about in the last lecture and as we've been talking about in class. So the first bit of research that we're going to look at was published back in just June of last year, so about a year ago. And what we're going to look at is an internet fact sheet. And that's kind of where we left off last time, is sort of that gap between Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. And, I mentioned, the Web 1.0 is, from the mid-1990s, and then Web 2.0 is late 1990s into up to 2010, 2012. And we want to, again, visit this change and how use of the internet has changed over that time period. And I think this data will really solidify the kinds of things that we've been talking about. So what you're looking at here is internet use over time, and this is percent of U.S. adults who use the internet. And so adults are those that are 18 years of age and older. You can see there's different ways of looking at this data. But what we're looking at here is from 2000 to 2019, okay? So 6 months ago or so, right? And you can see the percent of adults that are using the internet is 90%. So we have reached, what we would call saturation in culture. It's one thing that half of people are using something, but when almost 100% of people indicate the use of something, we have, something that is very much a pattern of social behavior, human behavior, okay? So the use of the internet is very commonplace for adults, 18 and older. Now, where it gets to be kind of interesting, and you're going to see this in a minute, is, maybe, 18 and older means that, just those that are younger adults are using the internet, and not so much older adults. Well, in some cases, that is what is occurring. But when you see something that is this high, then this gives us the notion of the understanding that this is spread across the population, regardless of age, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of income. And this is what we mean when we talk about sociocultural evolution. It's, one thing for something to be a fad, but when culture changes 100%, that is a major cultural shift. And that is exactly what not only the post-industrial information age has done, but even into this Web 1.0 and this Web 2.0. And right now we're just looking at the internet, but you're going to see this with the amount of use that not only adults, but teens, the use that they have of social media and social networking tools that are often examples of what we call Web 2.0. But right now we're just looking at the internet, and this is about a 20-year time period, and you can see that just over half of adults in the year 2000, just over half, and that's increased, you can see, by 50% over that time period. Okay, so I mentioned age, race, gender, income, education, and that's what we're going to look at here. Who uses the internet? So we can look at all these different factors, and we're going to thumb through these real quick. So age, percent of U.S. adults who use the internet. Now this is looking at it by age, and this is kind of what we expect to see. Younger people have a tendency to adopt new social behaviors, fresh social behaviors, before older folks do. Older folks get set in their ways. This is how they do things. And maybe things are a fad, like maybe TikTok is a fad, and it's something that just younger people use. Well, the internet is not a fad, all right? You do see more younger people that are using this. We look at 2019 here, and we look at 18 to 29-year-olds, just the very top line there. It's even hard to illustrate which number that is, because the 18 to 29s, the 30 to 49, and even the 50 to 64 are all so high. So again, basically 90% of people 18 to 64 years old, all right, are regular internet users. Now you can see here for older folks it drops down to 75% in 2019, but that's still a really large number. And you ask yourself, do your grandparents, for example, do they use the internet? Now, they may not use it as frequently as you do, but, this speaks to the proliferation of the internet and then Web 2.0 and all of that. So if everybody's using these things, then we do have to ask the question, what kinds of activity are they engaging in? What kind of behavior? What kind of interaction? Are they using the machine, or are they teaching the machine and the machine using us, as Michael Wesch, noted in his video presentation? So, all right, looking at this by race, what you're going to notice here is that these lines are almost overlapping. So regardless of race, almost regardless of age, it's still really high numbers of internet use in 2019, 2020. And you can see the drastic change since the year 2000. Looking at gender, it's almost exactly the same. These lines practically overlap one another. Income is a little bit of a variation, and generally those that make less money, this is the bottom line, have a more difficult time getting access to the internet. But even having said that, we're still talking about over 80% of those making less than $30,000 a year are still using the internet. That is a priority. You think about it that way. So, using the internet, and well, why are people using the internet? What are they doing with it? Well, that's another question, right? Looking at education, you see something similar. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to be using the internet. College graduates are almost 100% use the internet on a regular basis. Those that are less than a high school graduate, again, we're looking at adults here, but even those that don't have a high school education are still quite likely to be using the internet. This is an interesting variable, home broadband use as opposed to a dial-up connection. And, broadband access is so important because it makes your experience more seamless, right? There's less wait time. You have more access and ready access to information. It's quick, right? And this has changed. Broadband wasn't even really around in the year 2000. So we're talking 20 years ago, we've gone from basically nobody using that to now the percentage is up to about 73%. Okay. Who has home broadband? Now, notice here, it's true that internet adoption, as is true of internet adoption more broadly, home broadband adoption varies across demographic groups. Racial minorities, older adults, rural residents, and those with lower levels of education income are less likely to have broadband service at home. That is accurate. And, here we're looking at age, and those that are older are less likely to have broadband access, but, the numbers are still pretty high, okay? Especially once you start looking at those 18 to 64, numbers are still really high. Broadband use, again, is important because, again, ready access to the internet, information. So we go from whites having 79% of whites have access to broadband to 66% of blacks to 61% of Hispanics, okay? And that's a function of the cost. Broadband is not always cheap, right? You think about what kind of internet do you have at home, right? An interesting dynamic that we're going to look at here in a few minutes is that it's not just broadband and internet service at home. There's so many people that have mobile phones and have really good data connections with their cell phone that, especially with the young people, they're, more and more likely to just use their smartphone and not use a laptop. So you don't need broadband access with a smartphone because you can use the cell data, right? Some of you, I'm sure, are quite aware of that. Looking at this by gender, again, broadband use, looking at it by income, looking at about education. There is, again, some different levels of access based upon certain variables. That's a social class dynamic is what you see going on there. Percent of U.S. adults, and I was just speaking to this, but this is the percent of U.S. adults who do not use broadband at home, but they own smartphones. Okay, so you can, smartphones didn't really appear. I think the Pew Research Center didn't even start tracking smartphone use until around 2010, 2012. So, here we have a small number of adults, and, that's grown even up as high as 20%. I kind of think you're going to see this get higher and higher. People opting out of the cost of internet broadband at home and using smartphones and using cell data, 4G, 5G data access, and still being using the internet, but just using it through smartphones. But okay, so the next chart we're going to look at here, or piece of information, is again the Pew Research Center, and this is about 6 months old as well. And now we're looking at mobile technology, okay? So, we established that people are using the internet. It's almost 100% saturation rate for adults, okay? And I can tell you that it's the same for young people too, okay? And we're going to look at some data about teens here in just a moment. But so we've gone from, talking about, computers and the introduction of computers in the 60s and the change from industrial societies to post-industrial information age, and then the internet. And now we're talking about proliferation of the internet and culture across ages, across race, across gender, across education. And now, well, what about mobile phone use? How has that changed in the last 10 to 15 years? Okay, and so here we go, right? So this is cell phone use, the percent of U.S. adults who own the following devices. This is cell phone, the blue line up here, and that's really high. Again, almost 100% of adults own a cell phone. And the line below is smartphones. Over 80% own a smartphone. Okay? And so we've gone from 25% in around 2011 when the Pew Research Center just started tracking this. Smartphones haven't been around, really high functioning or high technology smartphones have not been around all that long, right? About 10 years or so. So we're talking about 35% of adults in 2011, and that's grown to over 80% in 2019. And again, cell phones up here, this might be like a Go phone, might be a flip phone that doesn't give you as much access to the internet and social media and social networking applications. And, these older cell phones, not really, they're still in circulation. And, one thing you got to think about is that if this number of people have a cell phone and this number of people have a smartphone, we may be getting to a situation where people have multiple phones. They may have a cell phone and a smartphone, or they may have a cell phone and a work phone. Some professionals do have that, where they've got multiple devices. Okay. Now, percent of the U.S. adults who own the following devices. Okay. Now, here's the separation between cell phone and smartphone. Okay. Here's the number, 81%. We'll look at just the smartphone column. It might make it a little bit easier to see. 96% of those 18 to 29 have a smartphone. And then those 30 to 49, 92%. Those 50 to 64, 80% of those that are 50 to 64 own a smartphone. Okay? And then the elderly population, less likely to see that. And you may have older relatives that insist on I don't have a Facebook, or, I don't need a smartphone. I just need to be able to use it to talk to people on the phone. Of course, you look on the other end of the equation, young people less likely to use their phones to talk to somebody because they just let the phone call run to voicemail. You probably heard me talk about those kinds of things before. So you can see how this varies according to race. Not a lot of variation according to race. Education level, there is some variation here. Less educated, less likely to have a smartphone. That's also got to do with social class, and smartphones are very expensive these days. There you can see income levels, obviously some variation there too. I like this chart here because it looks at e-readers, tablet computers, and a desktop laptop computer, right? And so the e-reader, and what we're talking about there is like the Kindle, where it's really limited, these small tablets that are like digital books. And, those peaked around the 2013, and they've kind of been on decline ever since. Of course, these have gotten really cheap now, but a small percentage of the population owns e-readers. Younger folks might not even know what those are, but a tablet computer, these continue to grow. Of course, you see variations in the kind of laptops and tablets that are on the market now. You see hybrid computers. That could be a laptop and then also be a tablet at the same time. Desktop and laptop computers are still more likely to be owned by adults. It seems, and you'll hear me telling you this as a student, laptops just have a better interface to do work on than, smartphones that are just too small too small. But we'll see, what the future might hold on how people use smartphones for what purposes. But we looked at that one already and looked at that one already. So the next thing we're going to look at is going to be teens, okay? Teens, social media and technology. This is a little bit older. It goes back to 2018. Still, in the social science is still considered pretty recent. But, again, the internet and Web 2.0 and behaviors that use technology changed so rapidly over the last 10 years that, sometimes data that's sometimes data that's 5 years old is just too old. And that's how fast that behaviors have changed around the use of mobile technologies, okay? So this information is presented a little bit differently than the previous data, but what I just want to focus on are some of these charts here, okay? So YouTube, Instagram, and Snapchat are the most popular online platforms among teens. And what do they use? Well, they use YouTube, Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook is just 50%. Now these are, all teens that are 17 years of age to 13 years of age. Okay. It's interesting to look how it matches adult social media, social networking use. Okay. Lower income teens are more likely than teens from higher income households to use Facebook. It's an interesting dynamic. The more wealthier you are in your family, the less likely you are to use Facebook. Okay, and that's status stuff, right? And it may be knowledge and access of the different services that things that you can do with these different tools. I'm going to leave this here for a second, let you all take a look at this. You might find it interesting. So teens have mixed views on social media's effect. On people their age. Many say it helps them connect with others. Some express concerns about bullying. And you can see here, among those who said mostly positive, the percent of those who give these is the main reason. So 31% say, social media use is mainly a positive thing. And of those that say that, these are the reasons why, because it helps them to connect, okay, to find news, interest, okay. Hold on just a second. Okay, sorry about that. I had to yell to some people to be quiet. Okay, thank you. All right, back to the program here. So those that say, let's look at this. 24% say it's mostly negative effect of the social media's impact. Again, some get a positive effect, some get a negative effect. Those numbers aren't too different from one another. And the reason why they say it's mostly negative is because of bullying, right? Harms relationships. People are too fake, basically, is what it says. So this is an interesting research about how teens see social networking and social media. Okay, some see it as positive, some see it as negative, and there's about half of the teen population is kind of in the middle. Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's not okay. These are some emotional feelings. These are there could be some issues of feeling positive about yourself, feeling negative about yourself, and this is an important chart for us to look at and to think about, because it makes me reflect on, what do adults do with teens about how to use social media and social networking? Do parents talk with young children about what they're using these things for? Do they talk to them and guide them about appropriate use? You take that one step further. What about, even elementary schools? How young are people getting access to phones and and using these and being immature and engaging in behaviors that might be destructive even. That's a pretty far way of taking that, but younger people are less likely to be able to handle interactions that end up being problematic, and it's more difficult for young people to work through those kinds of things. What does our society do with young people in terms of the concern of how they're using these social media and social networking applications, and what kind of impact is it having on the self, right? So, while adults are spending, most of their time in a physical world, they find themselves in a physical world, perhaps for younger people, their world is largely online as they are younger, and they may work into being in that physical world over time, or, maybe that socialization of using social media and social networking has longer lasting impact on the growth and development of a person's identity. And then as you get into young adulthood, how does interacting with people through social media and social networking help you or hurt you in terms of being able to interact with people in face-to-face encounters? And that is a good question to ask and to have you write a little bit more about, give your ideas about in your lecture notes. So I'm going to repeat that question. You need to write this down. Okay? How do interactions through social media and social network differ from interactions in face-to-face context? How do interactions in social media and social networking, online interactions, how do those differ in terms of face-to-face interactions? And so when you think about that, think about the apps that you use, right? YouTube, Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram. How do those interactions differ? How do you interact with people in those social media and social networking tools versus how do you interact with people in real life, in face-to-face interactions? So write a little bit about that, elaborate on that. You could get into several paragraphs on that. Be interested to see what you've got to say about that question, okay? So let's move on to the next chart here. Smartphone access is nearly ubiquitous among teens, while having a home computer varies by income. Okay, interesting dynamic. So look at this. The percent of U.S. teens who say they have or have access to a blank at home. So what percent of U.S. teens say they have access to a smartphone at home? Look at these numbers. Those are all in the 90% and up range, regardless of your gender, regardless of your race, regardless of your income, regardless of your parents' level of education. Young people have smartphones, okay? They might not have a laptop at home if you're poor, or a desktop computer, which, that's actually become an issue with our college courses going from face-to-face, those students that were taking face-to-face classes and all of a sudden have to take it online. We know, for example, at our school that we have a population of students that are lower income. They're having difficulty accessing the classes because they don't have internet connectivity or don't have computers at home. So hopefully some of our teachers are understanding that and designing some of the coursework to be accessible on a mobile phone, right? Something to think about. 45% of teens say they're online almost constantly, right? Look at how this has changed from 2014, 2015. 24% in 2014, 2015, 4 years later, constantly. So what are they doing? If you're on your phone constantly, what are you doing? And that goes back to the question about cognitive surplus. What are you doing with your time? It might be good to install an app on your phone that monitors what you're doing on your phone. Are you snapping all the time? Are you TikToking, Instagramming, texting, whatever, right? Cognitive surplus. Okay, so we're going to move to one last, let's see, we're moving into the 30-minute range. One last research piece here. All right, and this is going to be a social media fact sheet. Now, this is, again, looking at adults. So we looked at teens there for a few minutes, okay? And now we're going to look at adults, right? So adults are using social media and social networking as well. Probably not to the regularity that younger people are, but 2019 it's 72%. Okay, this is looking at those that are 18 to 29, those that are 30 to 49, and those that are 50 to 64, and you can see the numbers are pretty low down here for those that are 65 and up. So the percent of U.S. adults who use at least one social media site by age, the younger you are, the more likely you are to use social media and social networking. That's clear, okay? And that makes sense, right? Especially, the 18 to 29-year-olds, for all intents and purposes, they were brought up in an age where they were using the internet and probably using cell phones, and certainly they're much more comfortable and it's much more part of their identity, of their life, than older folks, right? This is social media and social networking. So adults are using Facebook. This is why young people don't use it as much anymore, because that's where the adults are. Look at YouTube use. That's really high as well, okay? And then, let's see, I think Instagram is next. Don't worry, young people. There's only 37% of adults that are using Instagram, so you can continue using Instagram. Of course, you can always develop your Finsta to completely separate yourself from the adults, right? And you see other different applications as well. Percent of U.S. adults who use, now this has got it broken out by age, and this is a kind of a complicated chart, so we're going to skip through that right now. Okay, not done yet.
I need to say something.
What?
That's something that you have. Can I get my $5 back? I need it.
Yes, I'll give you $5 after I'm done with this lecture.
Okay.
Some things are more important than lectures, like $5. Okay. So I think that's going to, kind of sum up this lecture. All right. Went through a lot of information there. Okay. I will. Well, I'm not gonna. I was gonna say I'll put the links down in the comments, but if you want to get access to this information, you should be able to see the internet address at the top during the video, and you're welcome to go search that. And it's really easy to find if you have an interest in exploring some of that data a little bit more. So, okay, so now we set the stage for moving into, why are people using their mobile phones, and why are people, using social media and social networking and the internet? I mean, it's a proliferation. And again, I like to put attention on this because we are completely fooling ourselves if we think that this human social behavior is not relevant in the context of people's sense of self and their identity. Okay? It is saturated throughout our society, regardless of age, race, gender, income. It varies a little bit in some of that regard, but people are using this stuff, right? And so that, again, that's going to set the stage for looking at some more, not more research, but to kind of explore a little bit more of the kinds of things that people are using social networking and social media for. So, till next time, peace.